Imagine, if you will, that you're orchestrating this massive, complex, just completely world-altering event.
Right.
Like, the stakes are as high as they can possibly get. We are talking about a total upheaval of the social order.
Oh, absolutely. Overthrowing a government.
Exactly. Overthrowing a government right in the middle of a global war. And
Yeah.
you've spent months, maybe even years, just meticulously planning the logistics,
Arguing over theory, building up those underground networks.
Right, doing all the hard work in the shadows. And you are days away from pulling the trigger on this grand operation.
The tension must have been unbelievable.
Right. But then you wake up, you open the morning newspaper, and you discover that your own top colleagues, the very people who sat in those secret planning meetings with you,
Uh-oh.
yeah, they have leaked the entire blueprint to the press.
I mean, it is difficult to overstate the level of jeopardy that puts you in.
It's insane.
You are entirely exposed. Exposed to your enemies, exposed to the state authorities, right at your absolute most vulnerable moment.
The element of surprise is just gone. Poof.
Completely gone.
But see, the story actually gets crazier.
Oh, I know it does.
Because despite that unbelievable, highly public leak, the event succeeds anyway. You pull it off. You take power.
Against all odds.
Right. But then, fast forward a few years, a new bureaucratic regime takes over the very state apparatus you just helped create.
And they decide they really don't like you.
Exactly. They view you as a threat.
Yeah.
So they systematically start rewriting the history books.
Erasing you.
Yeah. They completely erase your role as the tactical mastermind of this world-altering event. And they install this phantom committee, a group of guys who barely lifted a finger during the actual insurrection,
Right.
as the supposed heroes of the day. And the craziest part, they execute this massive cover-up while you and, millions of other people who lived through it are still alive to watch them do it.
It honestly sounds like the plot of a dystopian thriller. Like a really dark piece of speculative fiction. But we are talking about actual meticulously documented history here.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today's deep dive is taking us straight into the gritty, chaotic, and heavily falsified reality of the October 1917 Russian Revolution.
It's a fascinating era.
It really is. And we are going to be exploring a specific, highly detailed stack of sources today. We're looking at chapters 39 through 42 of Leon Trotsky's monumental work, The History of the Russian Revolution.
Along with several supplementary historical analyses, right?
Yeah, archival documents, party records from the 1920s and 30s. Our mission today is to dig into the actual mechanics of how this insurrection was planned.
They're fierce, very public battles inside the Bolshevik Party.
Yes, the brilliant institutional camouflage they used to pull it off, and finally the massive state-sponsored campaigns of historical falsification that followed under Joseph Stalin.
But before we jump into the timeline, we need to establish a very clear baseline for you, the listener.
Right, good point.
The source material we're examining today contains some highly charged political content.
Oh.
It deals intimately with Marxist theory, the revolutionary actions of the Bolsheviks, the mechanics of a military uprising, and the subsequent rise of Stalinism.
Yes, so a very, very important disclaimer here. We are not taking sides today.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing the Marxist left-wing or right-wing viewpoints found in these texts. Our goal is strictly to impartially report on and dissect the historical mechanics.
The ideological arguments.
Right, and the historiography contained in the original source material. We're just looking at how these historical actors operated, how they justified their actions, and how the history itself was later constructed and deconstructed by the state.
We're essentially performing an autopsy on a revolution.
Ooh, I like that.
And a simultaneous autopsy on a historical cover-up.
Yeah.
And to truly understand what these sources are revealing, we have to start by clearing away a massive historical myth, one that has clouded this event for a century.
They're talking about the monolith myth.
Exactly. For decades, there was this prevailing narrative about the October Revolution, the myth of the monolithic Bolshevik Party.
Right, the idea that the Bolsheviks were this perfectly unified, top-down, unquestioning machine. Like they just marched in lockstep from the minute they formed.
That is the narrative. And what the sources highlight is that both Western historians and Soviet historians push this exact same myth.
Really? Both sides?
Yeah, but for completely opposite reasons. During the Cold War, many Western historians wanted to portray the October Revolution not as a genuine social upheaval with popular support, but simply as a highly disciplined, conspiratorial military coup.
Right, so they depicted a fanatical cult of extremists who just obeyed Lenin's every command without a second thought.
Exactly, making it look like a fringe alien conspiracy rather than something organic.
And what about the Soviet side?
Well, over in the Soviet Union, the Stalinist bureaucracy needed to project an image of infallible, godlike leadership. They needed to justify their own dictatorial control in the present day.
Ah, I see.
So they needed to claim that the party had always been this perfectly unified monolith, effortlessly guided by a flawless central committee, which, of course, Stalin later claimed to inherit and embody.
But the archival documents and the first-hand accounts we are looking at today completely shatter that myth, don't they?
Well, they blow it to pieces.
Yeah, they show a party that was terrified, profoundly divided, deeply argumentative. I mean, they were practically tearing themselves apart in the public square on the very eve of the revolution.
Which really makes the fact that they actually succeeded even more astonishing.
Seriously. But before we get into the chaos, the inter-party backstabbing, and all the leaks, the sources make it very clear that we have to understand the theoretical framework driving the leadership.
Right. Why and the when.
Exactly. We have to understand why Lenin and Trotsky believed the autumn of 1917 was the exact mathematically perfect moment to strike. So let's explore this concept they call the Marxist art of insurrection.
This is a crucial starting point because it dictates all their subsequent actions. In the texts, Trotsky repeatedly insists, echoing Karl Marx, that armed insurrection is an art.
It's not just a riot.
Exactly. It's not a spontaneous uprising where angry people just pour into the streets and start breaking things.
Yeah.
To be successful, it requires cold scientific calculation.
Ardent resolution.
And incredibly precise timing.
Now, the sources draw a really sharp line between this concept of the art of insurrection and a different revolutionary philosophy called blanquism.
Yes.
I think we need to define those terms for the listener so we understand what the Bolsheviks were actively trying to avoid.
Okay, so Louis-Auguste Blanqui was a prominent 19th century French revolutionary.
Right.
His philosophy, blanquism, essentially proposes that a small, highly organized, and secretive conspiracy of armed men can seize state power at almost any time.
Just whenever they feel like it.
Pretty much. Regardless of the broader societal conditions. It's the belief that if you have a tight enough group of dedicated fighters, you can just execute a coup, take over the government buildings, and then impose your will on the country.
So it's the classic storm the castle approach. You just ignore whether the peasants in the fields or the soldiers on the borders actually support you.
Exactly. And Trotsky and Lenin argue vehemently against this approach in our texts. They contend that a genuine Marxist revolution is fundamentally different from a blanquist coup.
Because it requires the merging of two distinct forces, right?
Yes, two non-negotiable forces. First, you absolutely must have the objective conditions. This means a mass, nationwide revolutionary upsurge of the people.
A deep, paralyzing crisis within the existing government.
Right, and a shifting of the military forces away from the ruling class. But, they argue, a mass uprising on its own isn't enough. History shows that spontaneous mass energy will eventually burn itself out.
Or get crushed by the organized military of the state.
Exactly. So, second, you must combine that raw mass energy with the subjective preparation of a highly conscious, organized conspiracy.
The sources use a really specific historical comparison to illustrate this timing issue.
The July days.
Yeah. Lenin looks back at the situation in July 1917, just a few months prior, and compares it to September and October. The streets were chaotic in both instances, but the outcomes were vastly different.
So in July 1917, the workers and soldiers in Petrograd, the capital city, were incredibly frustrated.
With the provisional government's continuation of World War I.
Right, yes, and the lack of economic relief. They actually took to the streets in massive armed demonstrations demanding the Soviets take power.
And the Bolsheviks likely had the physical, military ability to seize the capital city right then and there.
They probably did. But Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership did something really counterintuitive. They actively restrained the masses.
Wait, they went out into the streets and told the armed workers to go home.
They did.
Why on earth would they tell their own supporters to stand down when they had the guns and the numbers in the capital?
Because the objective conditions across the entire vast Russian Empire weren't ripe yet.
Ah, so Petrograd was ready, but the rest of the country wasn't.
Precisely. The rest of the country, the millions of peasants in the provinces, and crucially the troops on the front lines, they still supported the moderate provisional government.
Oh, I see.
If the Bolsheviks had seized power in July, they would have been completely isolated in the capital. The government would have simply brought loyal troops back from the front lines and crushed the radical workers in Petrograd.
It would have been a catastrophic Blanquist mistake.
Exactly, leading to the destruction of the vanguard.
But then you fast forward to October, and the entire landscape of the country has shifted. The sources describe a complete breakdown of the old order.
The transformation was total. By October, the provisional government was functionally collapsing. The peasantry across Russia, tired of waiting for land reform, was in open revolt.
Burning manor houses, seizing estates.
Yeah. The soldiers at the front, freezing and starving, were mutinying and deserting in mass numbers.
And politically, the Bolsheviks had won the majorities in the democratic Soviets, the workers' and soldiers' councils, and all the major industrial centers.
The objective conditions had aligned perfectly. The national crisis was peaking, and Lenin argued from his hiding place that to hesitate now, to refuse to treat insurrection as an art when the masses were fully mobilized and waiting for a signal, would be a fatal betrayal of the revolution.
Okay, I follow the logic of the timing, but I want to represent a skeptical listener here and push back on this fundamental concept.
Sure, go ahead.
I want to use an analogy straight from Trotsky's own text. He writes, "Just as a blacksmith cannot seize the red-hot iron in his naked hand, so the proletariat cannot directly seize the power. It has to have an organization accommodated to this task."
It's a great metaphor.
It is, but he is very explicitly talking about coordinating a mass democratic insurrection with a secret, tightly controlled conspiracy. Doesn't calling it a conspiracy or an art completely contradict the whole premise of a mass democratic workers' revolution?
How do you mean?
Like, how do they theoretically justify orchestrating a secret plot within a movement that's supposedly about the masses taking control of their own destiny?
Well, that tension is the central paradox of their entire project. What the sources revere is how the Bolsheviks resolved that apparent contradiction in their own theory.
Okay.
They viewed the party, the organized conspiracy, not as a replacement for the masses, but as the necessary mechanical instrument. To stick with Trotsky's analogy, the party is the blacksmith's tongs.
And the spontaneous democratic revolutionary energy of the millions of workers and peasants is the red-hot iron.
Exactly. You can't forge a sword by just staring intensely at the hot iron.
Right. And if you try to grab it with your bare hands, you'll just burn your hand off and drop the metal.
Right. Without the organization, without the tactical plan and the art of the insurrection, the massive energy of the population just dissipates. It turns into aimless riots, uncoordinated strikes.
And eventually gets violently suppressed by whatever remains of the state's organized military.
Exactly. The hot iron simply cools down, hardens, and becomes useless. Conversely, if you just have the Kongs, the secret conspiracy, without the immense heat of the mass movement, you have absolutely nothing to shape.
You're just clacking empty tongs together in the air.
That's blanquism. Trotsky argues that the art of insurrection is identifying the precise, fleeting historical moment when you use the tongs of the conspiracy to firmly grasp and direct the red-hot energy of the masses to strike a definitive, coordinated blow against the state machinery.
So, in their view, the conspiracy isn't overriding the will of the masses. It's the structural framework that actually allows the will of the masses to survive and win against an entrenched state.
According to the theoretical framework laid out in these chapters, yes. That is the Leninist synthesis. It requires both the sweeping, undeniable mandate of the population and the ruthless conspiratorial mechanics of a military strike.
Well, if the theory required such mathematically precise, unified, and scientific execution, you would naturally expect the Bolshevik Party to be a well-oiled, highly disciplined machine in the fall of 1917.
You would think so.
But that brings us to the reality of the situation, which was terrifyingly divided. The tongs were basically snapping in half in the blacksmith's hands.
The historical record provided in the text makes the idea of a monolithic party evaporate instantly.
Instantly.
While Lenin is frantically writing letters from exile in Finland, demanding an immediate armed uprising, two of his oldest, closest, and most prominent colleagues in the highest echelons of the Bolshevik leadership are fighting him tooth and nail.
We need to talk about Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamem. These aren't minor, low-level functionaries or new recruits.
Oh, no. These guys are top-tier founding members of the Bolshevik faction. They have been with Lenin for over a decade.
So why were they so vehemently opposed to the plan to take power?
Zinoviev and Kamenev fundamentally opposed the idea of an armed insurrection at that specific moment. They looked at the exact same objective conditions Lenin did, the starving cities, the deserting troops, but they drew the completely opposite conclusion.
Interesting.
They looked at the military academies in Petrograd, The Cossack regiments still theoretically loyal to the government, the artillery units, and they panicked.
They got cold feet.
Basically. Their core argument was that a premature armed uprising would lead to the total slaughter of the vanguard working class and the complete destruction of the Bolshevik Party. They believed the enemy was still too strong, and the Bolsheviks were overestimating their own military capacity.
So if they didn't want to overthrow the government, what was their alternative plan? Just give up and go home?
No. They advocated for a defensive parliamentary posture. They wanted to wait for the upcoming elections to the Constituent Assembly.
Okay, let's clarify what that is for the listener. The Constituent Assembly was basically going to be a bourgeois democratic parliament, similar to a Western European government, right?
Correct. The provisional government had promised to hold democratic elections for a national parliament to draft a new constitution. Zinoviev and Kamenev believed the Bolsheviks should abandon the goal of a completely socialist revolution governed exclusively by the workers' Soviets.
Wow, just abandon the whole socialist revolution part?
For the time being, yeah. Instead, they thought the Bolsheviks could win a massive chunk of seats in this new Constituent Assembly, form a strong opposition bloc alongside other moderate left-wing parties, and influence the country's development legally and peacefully.
They essentially wanted to settle for being a strong progressive wing in a developing capitalist democracy, rather than risking annihilation in a violent coup.
Exactly.
And this disagreement wasn't just a polite academic debate over tea. This was a brutal existential political brawl that threatened to tear the entire movement apart. The sources give us a really intense timeline of these meetings.
Oh, the timeline is wild.
Let's look at October 10th. The Bolshevik Central Committee holds a secret late-night meeting in an apartment in Petrograd. Lenin actually sneaks into the city to attend, wearing a disguise.
A wig and glasses, having shaved his famous beard.
Classic spy stuff. He pushes a resolution declaring that an armed uprising is inevitable, and the party must immediately prepare for it militarily. The resolution passes by a vote of 10-2.
And the two dissenting votes are Zinoviev and Kamenev.
And their opposition doesn't stop after losing the vote. They refuse to submit to the majority. 6 days later, on October 16th, the party holds an expanded meeting of the Central Committee, bringing in representatives from the military organizations and local Petrograd activists.
Lenin again argues for immediate decisive action. Zinoviev and Kamenev again take the floor and argue passionately against it,
warning that the party is marching toward a bloodbath.
Exactly. But the broader committee again sides with Lenin, reaffirming the call for insurrection. And in response to this second defeat, Kamenev takes the extreme step of resigning from the Central Committee in protest.
Which is incredibly dramatic for an underground revolutionary organization.
Very dramatic.
But then we get to the leak. October 18th. This is the moment I mentioned in the introduction. What exactly did Zinoviev and Kamenev do that nearly destroyed the entire revolution?
Well, on October 18th, Kamenev and Zinoviev published an open letter.
Okay.
But they didn't publish it in a clandestine Bolshevik leaflet or an internal party circular. They published it in Novaya Zine, which translates to New Life.
And what was that?
This was a non-party, widely read independent newspaper run by the famous Russian writer Maxim Gorky. At that time, Gorky's paper was highly critical of the Bolsheviks' radicalism.
So everybody was reading this paper?
Everybody, including the government ministers and the military generals. In this incredibly public forum, Kamenev and Zinoviev explicitly exposed the fact that the Bolshevik leadership had secretly decided to launch an armed uprising.
Oh my God.
And they publicly condemned the plan as an act of fatal despair that would ruin the revolution and destroy the working class.
Hold on. You're telling me that in the middle of a massive global war, on the very eve of a revolution, two top leaders go to a public, mainstream newspaper, publish the secret battle plans for a violent coup, and they aren't immediately lined up against a wall and shot for treason?
It sounds impossible, doesn't it?
It goes against everything we are traditionally taught about the Bolsheviks being this ruthless, monolithic death squad from day one. How does the party, and the government for that matter, respond to this?
Your disbelief highlights exactly why these sources are so valuable for understanding the reality of 1917 rather than the later mythology.
Right.
The fact that they weren't instantly executed reveals two vital truths about the situation. First, it reveals the sheer weakness, paralysis, and hollowed-out nature of the provisional government at that specific moment.
Even when handed the enemy's battle plan in the morning paper.
Exactly. The government was so devoid of actual military power and popular support that they couldn't muster the forces to preemptively strike and arrest the Bolshevik leadership. The troops simply wouldn't obey their orders anymore.
So the government was basically a ghost? And what does it reveal about the Bolsheviks?
It reveals just how deeply democratic, argumentative, and permeable the Bolshevik Party actually was at the time. It completely defies the later Stalinist myth of a top-down monolith where everyone just saluted and obeyed the supreme leader.
Right, because here you have two top leaders openly sabotaging the party's most critical, secretive life-or-death decision in an opposition newspaper. The party didn't immediately purge them.
But Lenin was absolutely apoplectic, as you can imagine.
Oh, I bet. The sources quote his reaction from his underground hideout, and he is not holding back.
Not at all. Lenin was furious beyond measure. He wrote blistering letters to the Central Committee demanding their immediate expulsion from the party. He called their actions infinitely vile.
Wow.
He branded them strikebreakers of the revolution.
Which is a deeply insulting term for a Marxist.
The worst. He argued that it is one thing to disagree internally during the planning phase, but to take the party's secret military plans and broadcast them to the enemy on the very eve of battle was an unforgivable betrayal, akin to treason.
And yet, despite Lenin's fury and his immense authority, they were not expelled.
No, they weren't.
The Central Committee actually pushed back against Lenin's demand. They kept Zinoviev and Kamenev in the party, merely ordering them to step down from leadership roles and stop talking to the press.
Exactly.
And there's a fascinating detail in the sources about Joseph Stalin's role during this exact crisis.
Yes. Stalin, who was a member of the Central Committee and an editor of the party newspaper Pravda, actually published an editorial note trying to smooth things over.
Really?
Yeah. He defended Zinoviev and Kamenev, stating that despite sharp disagreements, the party remained fundamentally unified. And he criticized Lenin's harsh tone.
Wait, Stalin criticized Lenin?
Yes. This is a critical historical detail because it shows Stalin taking a conciliatory, almost right-wing, hesitant position at the crucial moment. He was trying to compromise with those who opposed the insurrection.
That completely shatters the later narrative that Stalin was Lenin's closest, most steadfast military lieutenant.
It really does.
So we have the party fracturing at the top, the plans broadcast to the entire country, the government on high alert, and Lenin hiding in a safe house writing angry letters. Let me pause and synthesize this.
All right.
Trotsky is sitting in Petrograd, tasked with actually organizing this uprising. He can't just march thousands of armed workers and sailors through the streets under a giant banner that says Bolshevik coup now.
No, definitely not.
The element of surprise is gone. How on earth does he move troops into position, distribute weapons, and take over the city without being arrested? He needs some kind of massive institutional cover.
This is where the tactical genius of the October Revolution really comes into focus, and where the sources detail the creation of an entirely new institution. You're right. After the leak in Gorky's paper, the Bolsheviks couldn't operate openly as a party organizing an offensive coup.
It would be suicide.
Exactly. They needed a legally recognized, broadly accepted institution to act as a front. They needed to legitimize their military movements in the eyes of the soldiers and the broader public.
And they found that cover in the Petrograd Soviet.
Yes. We should clarify what the Petrograd Soviet was. It was a massive, democratic, citywide council composed of elected deputies from the factories and the military garrisons.
So it was entirely separate from the official provisional government.
Entirely separate.
Yeah.
And by October, the Petrograd Soviet had immense authority. The workers and soldiers listened to the Soviet, not to the government ministers.
Right.
In early October, the moderate socialist parties, who were still in the Soviet spirits, the Mensheviks, who were reformist socialists, and the right social revolutionaries, who represented the more conservative peasantry, actually proposed creating a committee of revolutionary defense.
Why did the moderates want a defense committee?
Because the German army was advancing toward Petrograd. The front lines were collapsing. The moderates genuinely wanted to organize the defense of the capital against a foreign imperialist invasion.
But the Bolsheviks, who had recently won the voting majority in the Petrograd Soviet, completely hijacked this moderate proposal.
They seized upon it brilliantly. Trotsky, who was now the elected president of the Petrograd Soviet, took this Menshevik proposal for a defense committee and completely transformed its scope.
Okay.
The Bolsheviks voted to create what became known as the Military Revolutionary Committee, or the MRC. And they used this official legal organ of the Soviet to systematically take control of every single military garrison, weapons depot, and strategic point in the city, entirely under the guise of defending the capital from the Germans and from domestic counter-revolutionaries.
The sources detail how Trotsky deliberately designed the MRC to look as non-threatening and nonpartisan as possible to the outside observer. He needed a figurehead to make this look completely independent from the Bolshevik Central Committee.
Right.
I know he goes with a man named Pavel Lazimir, a member of the Left Social Revolutionary Party. But I have to ask, why him? Was it just because he was young and naive? Why is placing a left SR at the head of the committee considered such brilliant camouflage?
It wasn't just about his youth or modesty. It was entirely about the demographic and political faction he represented.
Explain that.
The left social revolutionaries were the radical wing of a massive, predominantly peasant-based party. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were primarily a party of the urban industrial working class. By placing a left SR at the nominal head of the Military Revolutionary Committee, Trotsky signaled to the entire country, and especially to the millions of peasant soldiers in the army, that this was not just a narrow partisan Bolshevik power grab.
Oh, I see. It made the MRC look like a broad, multi-party, united front.
Exactly. Representing the whole of the Soviet democracy workers and peasants alike.
It's the ultimate political optics. I love the detail in the text about Trotsky literally editing Lazimir's drafts for the committee's founding charter.
That's a great part.
Lazimir drafted the rules, and Trotsky went through it with a red pen. He sharpened all the practical operational plans for how the committee would actually command the troops, appoint commissars, and requisition weapons. But he deliberately glossed over any revolutionary language.
Yep.
He made sure the charter was entirely framed around defending the city, protecting the revolution from right-wing conspiracies, and maintaining public order.
Never once did they officially use the word insurrection or uprising in these founding documents or public proclamations. It was entirely framed as a defensive administrative measure. They were just defending the elected Soviet.
Right.
But in reality, as the sources explicitly state, the MRC rapidly became the actual general staff of the insurrection. While Lazimir was the public face signing the papers, the actual heavy lifting, the tactical planning, and the strategic direction were done almost exclusively by hardcore Bolshevik military organizers.
People like Nikolai Podvoisky, Vladimir Antonov-Ovsenko.
And of course, Trotsky himself, who was guiding the entire apparatus from a room in the Smolny Institute.
You know, to explain how this worked mechanically, let's use an analogy from the business world.
Okay, let's hear it.
The creation of the MRC is essentially like setting up a corporate shell company for a hostile takeover.
Oh, I like that. How does that map onto the events of October?
Well, if a ruthless corporate raider wants to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a rival business, and they don't want the rival board of directors to realize they're buying up all their stock and assets, they don't do it under their own infamous name.
Right.
They set up a legitimate-sounding, completely boring shell company. Let's call it Petrograd Defense Holdings. They recruit a nice, modest, widely respected guy from another firm, a Lazimir, and put him on the board of directors as the public face and CEO.
The figurehead.
Exactly. They use this legitimate shell company to openly acquire assets, sign vendor contracts, and organize resources. Everyone in the market thinks it's just regular, boring administrative business, but secretly, the corporate raiders are using that shell company as the vehicle to systematically strip the rival business of all its power before executing the final hostile buyout.
That is a highly accurate and effective analogy for the mechanics of the MRC. And if we connect this tactical maneuver back to the broader Marxist theory we discussed earlier, it perfectly illustrates the art of insurrection in practice.
How so?
Well, the Bolshevik Party provided this secret plan, the ideological resolve, and the hardcore leadership. The conspiracy, the blacksmith's tongs. But the Military Revolutionary Committee provided the legal authority, the institutional cover, and the direct connection to the broader masses of soldiers.
Ah.
By merging the legal authority of a mass democratic movement with the underground mechanics of a military strike, they were able to issue direct, treasonous orders to the military garrisons.
Orders like, do not obey the government, only obey the MRC.
Exactly. And the soldiers actually obeyed, because they believed they were just following the legal orders of the democratically elected Soviet.
It's a masterclass in political judo. They used the government's own crumbling institutional weight against it. And it worked. The MRC systematically took over the telegraph offices, the train stations, the bridges, and the arsenals.
They successfully directed the seizure of state power on October 25th, almost without firing a single shot in Petrograd.
Which is incredible, because by the time they formally arrested the provisional government ministers, the MRC had already quietly stripped them of all military support.
They were just men in a room at that point.
Which brings us to the most fascinating and frankly chilling part of our deep dive. We are shifting from the messy, brilliant reality of history to the dark art of historiography.
Yes, we are moving from how history is made to how history is forcibly rewritten by the state.
So we've established extensively from the primary texts, the archival documents, and the timeline that Lenin was the ideological engine demanding the uprising.
Yes.
And Trotsky was the tactical, on-the-ground commander leading the MRC and orchestrating the actual seizure of the city. But the listener is undoubtedly wondering, where was Joseph Stalin during all of this?
That's the big question.
He eventually becomes the absolute dictator of the Soviet Union. Surely, according to the official history, he was leading the charge, rifle in hand, right?
According to the official Soviet history written years later, absolutely. According to the Stalinist textbooks published in the 1930s, Stalin was the one entirely in charge of the revolution. He was the supreme military commander.
Wow.
But according to the actual archival documents from 1917, the meeting minutes, and Trotsky's analysis in our sources, Stalin was largely invisible during the decisive October days.
Invisible.
He was not a public orator addressing the crowds. He was not in the MRC command center directing troop movements. He was operating quietly in the background, mostly fulfilling administrative duties on the editorial board of the party newspaper. He completely missed the actual day of the insurrection.
Okay, let me pause you there because the mechanics of this are mind-boggling. If Stalin wasn't the heroic military commander, how do you pull off a historical cover-up of this magnitude?
It takes a lot of effort.
I mean, everyone alive in Russia in 1917 knew Trotsky led the Military Revolutionary Committee. It was in all the daily newspapers. International journalists like John Reed wrote about it in books like 10 Days That Shook the World, which were published globally.
Yes, it was very well documented.
So how does a bureaucracy just edit a world-famous, highly visible historical figure out of a revolution and insert a guy who is basically editing the newspaper?
Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical process that requires a massive state apparatus and a monopoly on information. The falsification really kicked into high gear in 1924, right around the time Lenin died, and the fierce struggle for succession within the party exploded.
The power vacuum.
Exactly. Stalin formed an alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev, the very same men who leaked the uprising plans in 1917, ironically enough.
Wow, history is crazy.
This ruling triumvirate needed to destroy Trotsky's immense prestige and popularity within the military and the party. To do that, they realized they had to sever his connection to the foundational myth of the state. They had to rewrite the history of October.
And how exactly did they do it? What was the specific mechanism they used to insert Stalin into the timeline?
They sent loyal historians digging deep into the party archives, looking for anything they could use. And they found a piece of paper. The minutes from that expanded October 16th Central Committee meeting.
Okay, let me remember. That was the meeting where Kamenev and Zinoviev argued against the uprising for the second time.
That's the one. Well, at the very end of that stressful, chaotic meeting, almost as an administrative afterthought, the Central Committee passed a minor resolution to create a 5-man practical center to assist with the local party organization for the upcoming struggle.
Okay, I want to make sure the listener is tracking this because a lot of names get thrown around in Soviet history.
Right.
The sources list the 5 men appointed to the center as Yakov Sverdlov, Joseph Stalin, Andrei Bubnov, Moisey Uritsky, and Felix Dzerzhinsky.
Right.
Basically, they took a random committee of mid-level party managers and editors, none of whom were actually commanding troops on the ground during the insurrection, and decided to use this piece of paper as their golden ticket.
Exactly. Starting in 1924, the bureaucratic historians took this obscure, forgotten resolution and blew it up to mythological proportions. They began claiming in hundreds of thousands of printed articles, state-sponsored textbooks, and speeches that this practical center, which happened to include Stalin, was the actual, secret, supreme command organ that guided the entire revolution.
That is bold.
They claimed it bypassed the Soviet, commanded the troops, and orchestrated the overthrow of the government, rendering Trotsky and the MRC mere figureheads.
But the sources we are analyzing say this is a complete, verifiable fabrication. How does Trotsky mechanically debunk this myth in his history?
Trotsky debunks it by using the bureaucracy's own archival documents against them. First, he points out a deliberate, glaring omission in how the Stalinist historians quoted the text. Whenever the state historians cited the October 16th resolution to prove Stalin's leadership, they always suspiciously cut off the final sentence of the document.
Wait, really? Just chopped off the end?
Yeah. Trotsky went to the original archive and showed that the final sentence explicitly stated, "This center becomes a constituent part of the Revolutionary Soviet Committee."
The Revolutionary Soviet Committee, meaning the Military Revolutionary Committee, the MRC.
Precisely. The resolution merely assigned those 5 party members to go embed themselves in and assist the MRC, which was already functioning and was headed by Trotsky.
So it was just a subcommittee.
It was not a superior command body at all. It was explicitly defined as a subordinate appendage to Trotsky's committee. But by simply omitting that single sentence in every textbook, the historians made it look like an independent Supreme Command Center led by Stalin.
That is incredibly insidious. It's literal historical erasure by omission. But surely if this practical center was the Supreme Command, there would be a paper trail of its brilliant leadership. Did this committee of 5 actually do anything?
That is the second most devastating piece of evidence Trotsky brings forward. There is zero historical record of this practical center ever actually meeting, functioning, or issuing a single command. Nothing. There are no minutes of its meetings. There are no military orders signed by it. None of the participants, soldiers, or commanders in the uprising ever mentioned receiving directives from it in their memoirs or post-action reports.
Wow.
Even the official Soviet historical encyclopedias published in the early 1920s, before the censorship became total, couldn't find a single document showing what this center did. It was a phantom committee that existed only as a quick administrative idea on a piece of paper on October 16th and was entirely absorbed and superseded by the massive reality of the MRC.
But if there is absolutely no evidence it did anything, and thousands of living veterans of the revolution knew it was fake, how did the bureaucracy get away with teaching this as absolute, unquestioned fact?
Because by the mid to late 1920s, the bureaucracy began to completely solidify its totalitarian grip over the state apparatus. They controlled every single printing press in the country. They controlled the universities, the historical institutes, and the archives.
Total control.
They instituted forced textbook revisions in every school. If a historian, a teacher, or even a veteran of the revolution tried to write or speak about the actual documented role of the MRC and Trotsky, they would be censored, fired from their job, expelled from the party, or eventually arrested by the secret police.
Oh, that is terrifying.
The bureaucracy simply couldn't rely on the actual messy history of 1917. That history featured Trotsky as a brilliant, decisive hero and Stalin as a secondary figure who vacillated and tried to compromise with the people who leaked the plans. So they used the blunt force of state terror to mandate a new reality.
It is terrifying when you fully grasp the mechanics of it. If you control the present levers of power and communication, you can literally manufacture the past.
Yes, you can.
But erasing Trotsky's operational role in the insurrection wasn't enough to fully secure the bureaucracy's power, was it? They couldn't just say he didn't do much in October.
Because he was still around.
Exactly. He was still sitting right there in Moscow, leading the left opposition, writing brilliant critiques, and arguing vehemently against the bureaucracy's domestic and foreign policies. So they had to go further. They had to turn him into a fundamental ideological enemy of the state itself, and that requires exploring the invention of Trotskyism.
This is perhaps the most profound and globally consequential part of the historical analysis in our sources. To truly defeat Trotsky politically in the 1920s, erasing his military record wasn't sufficient.
Right.
The triumvirate of Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev realized they had to invent a coherent, historical, anti-Marxist ideology and attach his name to it. They had to create the phantom menace of Trotskyism.
When the sources say they invented it, what exactly does that mean? Didn't Trotsky have his own distinct philosophical theories and writings?
He certainly did, most notably his theory of permanent revolution. But what the ruling triumvirate did in the autumn of 1924 was highly cynical. They dug deep into the archives and resurrected old, bitter, pre-1917 theoretical disputes and polemics between Lenin and Trotsky.
So stuff from years before the revolution.
Yeah. Now, it is a historical fact that Lenin and Trotsky argued fiercely between 1903 and early 1917 over the nature of the party and the trajectory of the revolution. They called each other terrible names in print. But as the sources emphasize heavily, when the actual revolution erupted in 1917, they put those old debates aside and united completely.
They buried the hatchet.
They really did.
Yeah.
Trotsky formally joined the Bolsheviks, and Lenin declared there was no better Bolshevik than Trotsky. They worked in total philosophical and tactical synchronization to execute the insurrection and win the brutal civil war that followed.
Right. They argued in the theoretical planning phase, but they were entirely on the same page when it actually mattered, when the guns were drawn.
Exactly. But in 1924, to discredit Trotsky's contemporary, entirely valid criticisms of the growing bureaucratic dictatorship, Zinoviev and Kamenev, working hand-in-glove with Stalin, took all those old, resolved pre-1917 arguments, stripped them of their context, and presented them to the public as a current, dangerous, fundamentally anti-Leninist ideology.
That is so underhanded.
They claimed that Trotskyism was a distinct, hostile philosophy characterized by a fundamental underestimation of the peasantry, an aristocratic disdain for the party, and that Trotsky had basically always been a secret enemy of true Bolshevism who just pretended to agree with Lenin in 1917.
Let me try a modern political analogy here to capture the scale of what they were doing.
Go for it.
It's like a modern political party realizing one of their current leaders is exposing massive corruption within the administration. Instead of debating the current corruption, the party leadership digs up a voting record from 20 years ago from a completely different political era under a different administration where that leader voted against the current party line.
A total misdirection.
Yeah, they weaponize that ancient, irrelevant voting record to paint the whistleblower as a lifelong traitor and a secret enemy operative, deliberately distracting the public from the actual current issues being raised.
That captures the mechanics of the smear campaign perfectly. It was a massive campaign of historical distraction and defamation, and the sources point out a deeply tragic, almost Shakespearean irony in who was orchestrating this.
Oh, I have to stop here because the irony is just too thick to ignore.
Isn't it?
Zinoviev and Kamenev, the exact same two guys who completely lost their nerve in October 1917, who literally leaked the secret plans for the revolution to a public newspaper, and who were branded as strikebreakers and traitors by Lenin himself, they are the ones who helped Stalin invent Trotskyism to paint Trotsky as the bad guy who betrayed Lenin.
That is the ultimate grim irony that Trotsky highlights in his history. Zinoviev and Kamenev knowingly built this machine of historical lies and ideological distortion to preserve their own power in the triumvirate and sideline Trotsky.
Unreal.
They helped forge the big lie that served as the foundational ideological cement of the rising Stalinist bureaucracy. But it is exactly like building a massive Frankenstein's monster to attack your political rival, completely failing to realize you can't control it.
The monster always turns on its creator.
Invariably. Once Stalin had successfully used Zinoviev and Kamenev's intellectual weight to politically destroy and exile Trotsky, he no longer needed them. He turned the machinery of falsification and state terror directly on them.
Wow.
Because Zinoviev and Kamenev, too, eventually realized that the bureaucracy under Stalin was betraying the core principles of the revolution, and they belatedly went into political opposition. But it was far too late. The apparatus of censorship, falsification, and repression they had eagerly helped construct swallowed them whole.
So what happened to them?
Both Zinoviev and Kamenev fell victim to Stalin's infamous show trials in the 1930s. They were forced to confess to absurd, fabricated crimes, and they were executed, accused of being part of the very same vast, counter-revolutionary Trotskyist plots they themselves had helped invent.
That is incredibly dark and a brutal lesson in political blowback. But this raises a vital, underlying question that we have to answer to fully understand the sources. Why did Stalin and the bureaucracy need this specific lie?
What do you mean?
Why target Trotsky's theories so viciously? If Stalin just wanted absolute dictatorial power and he controlled the police, why not just arrest Trotsky on trumped-up criminal charges and be done with it? Why go through the massive, elaborate intellectual gymnastics of inventing a whole new raidism to fight?
This is where the historical analysis connects the ideological lies to the shifting material reality of the Soviet Union. The Stalinist bureaucracy in the mid-1920s was adopting a deeply conservative, nationalist focus.
Okay.
The country was exhausted by years of World War and devastating civil war. Furthermore, the revolution had not spread successfully to the advanced industrial nations of Western Europe, like Germany, as they had originally hoped.
Right, they were isolated.
So the bureaucracy advanced a radically new theory, championed by Stalin, called socialism in one country. They argued that Russia could just build a fully socialist society all by itself, essentially making peace with the surrounding global capitalist system.
As long as they stayed in power.
Exactly. So long as the bureaucracy was left alone in peace to manage the state and enjoy its newly acquired material privileges, better housing, and specialized access to goods.
I see. They wanted to pull up the drawbridge, abandon the chaotic international struggle, and just get comfortable in their new offices.
Precisely. But this new conservative theory of socialism in one country completely contradicted the foundational theories of 1917.
Ah.
The entire premise of the October Revolution, which was shared entirely by both Lenin and Trotsky, was internationalism. The firm belief that the Russian Revolution was merely the opening spark for a global socialist revolution, and that true socialism could not possibly survive, let alone thrive, in isolation in a backward, impoverished peasant country.
And Trotsky was still pushing for that.
Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was the absolute embodiment of that relentless internationalist drive.
Ah. So Trotsky's existence and his adherence to the original Marxist theory was a constant, glaring intellectual reminder that the bureaucracy had abandoned the original mission of the revolution.
Exactly. They had to totally demonize Trotsky's theories because those theories were a direct existential threat to the bureaucracy's right to exist in its comfortable nationalist privileged state.
They couldn't just admit they liked their new perks.
Right. They couldn't just stand up and say to the hungry workers, we're abandoning the world revolution because we like our new privileges and want stability.
Mm-hmm.
They had to create a sophisticated, theoretical justification for their conservatism.
That makes total sense.
They had to invent a historical crime, Trotskyism, to justify their current political betrayal of the revolution's internationalist goals. The massive falsification of the past, the erasure of the MRC, the invention of the practical center, the weaponization of old debates, all of it was entirely necessary to protect the material interests and the political power of the bureaucracy in the present.
Wow. Okay, that connects all the fragmented pieces into a very cohesive, if terrifying, picture.
Right.
Let's do a quick recap of the massive historical territory we've covered in this deep dive.
Good idea.
We started by examining the rigorous theoretical framework, the intricate, highly calculated scientific Marxist art of planning an insurrection.
Understanding that you have to balance the blazing hot iron of a mass democratic upsurge with the disciplined organizational tongs of a vanguard party.
Right. Then we looked at how messy and human the reality of executing that theory was. We explored the inner party struggle, where top foundational leaders like Zinoviev and Kamenev buckled under the immense historical pressure.
Vehemently opposed the uprising.
And actually leaked the highly classified military plans to an opposition newspaper.
Which, in turn, forced Trotsky and the pro-insurrection wing to pivot tactically and deploy the brilliant institutional camouflage of the Military Revolutionary Committee.
They used a legally recognized Soviet institution, fronted by a left SR figurehead, to organize a massive hostile takeover of the military and the state, right under the paralyzed provisional government's nose.
And finally, we examined the chilling aftermath that played out over the following decade. The massive state-sponsored rewriting of history to invent the phantom practical center.
The deliberate erasure of Trotsky's central military role.
And the tragic, ironic invention of Trotskyism to mask the new bureaucracy's retreat into nationalist conservatism and to justify their destruction of the original revolutionaries.
So after going through all this granular detail, why does this deeply historical, factional infighting from over a century ago matter to you, listening right now?
It's a valid question.
It matters deeply because it serves as the ultimate case study in how history is actively manufactured. It proves that history is not just a passive, objective record of things that happened in the past.
Far from it.
History is an active, vital weapon. It is constantly forged, edited, omitted, and sometimes entirely fabricated from thin air to control the political narrative of the present and to dictate the possibilities of the future.
Absolutely.
The archival documents these sources draw from prove that the official story we are told, even about the biggest, most well-documented events in human history, can be a meticulously constructed lie designed to protect the material interests of the people currently in power.
It serves as a stark reminder that rigorous critical thinking, a reliance on primary sources, and a willingness to question the accepted narrative are absolutely essential survival skills.
Especially when that narrative perfectly serves the interests of a powerful state or institutional apparatus.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive into the archives.
Let's hear it.
If a massive modern political regime could successfully rewrite the history of one of the most public, highly reported, world-shaking events of the 20th century.
Literally editing out the tactical commander of the insurrection.
Right, and replacing him with a phantom committee that did absolutely nothing. And if it could successfully do this while millions of participants were still alive to remember the truth, what parts of the history you accept as basic, unquestioned fact today might actually just be the successful, unexamined PR campaigns of yesterday's victors. When you look at the X-ray of our own modern history, are you certain you are seeing the actual bones or just a picture someone very powerful drew for you?